Hello, Simon Kids subscribers. My name is Sandra Neil Wallace, and I am the author of Marjory Saves the Everglades, the story of Marjory Stoneman Douglas. And today I'm going to be reading to you from this picture book biography. Are you ready? Great. Here we go. Marjory Saves the Everglades, the story of Marjory Stoneman Douglas, written by Sandra Neil Wallace and illustrated by Rebecca Gibbon. Before airplanes and automobiles, a girl in gold-rimmed glasses sailed on a steamboat to Florida. In a grove ripe with dimpled fruit, she bit into an orange, sweet and sticky. Far from home and safe in her father's arms, young Marjory Stoneman shared his hazel eyes and a thirst for the tropical light. Now a seed was planted for her love of Florida, but it would be a long time before Marjory felt the southern sunlight again or her father's warm hug. After the trip, she trekked to Taunton with her mother, back to apple trees and snow. They lived with her grandparents and Aunt Fanny in a house with an attic window facing the stars. While the grown-ups talked, Marjory climbed quietly into the attic and read. Books became her best friends. So did the outdoors. In the winter, she hopped on her red bicycle and rode into the forest to find a Christmas tree. In springtime, she watched herring flip-flopping in the Taunton River, slow and steady at first, then whoosh, like a tidal wave, flapping against the current to lay their eggs. When Marjory turned 18, she zoomed to Wellesley College. She wrote to Mother and Aunt Fanny about the mighty oak trees turning scarlet, but she never forgot the seed that had been planted when she was a child. As more seasons passed, 24-year-old Marjory married, but the union failed. She kept the Douglas name and boarded a train, leaving her old life behind. Heading south, the train twisted and turned through forests of pine. While Marjory slept, it chugged toward palm trees. By morning, a tropical light, familiar and bright, woke her up. Marjory's heart beat faster as the train screeched to a stop. She'd arrived at her destination, Miami, Florida. A kind man with graying hair hopped aboard and strode toward her. "Hello, Father," she said. And just like that, after 19 years of never seeing him, Marjory hugged her father. There we were, reunited with no fuss and feathers, she said. Marjory's father had started the Miami Herald newspaper. He asked her to be a reporter. She couldn't wait to begin. 2 or 3 reporters is all we had. I was the only woman, she said. Finally, she found her voice. It wasn't her father's voice, her mother's voice, or Aunt Fanny's. It was entirely the voice of Marjory Stoneman Douglas. She wrote about schools of mullet leaping over Biscayne Bay, sandy streets shimmering like moonlight on snow, and how women should have the vote, same as the men. In 1917, with World War I raging in Europe, Marjory longed to write about the women joining the war effort. But no woman from Florida had enlisted in the Navy, so Marjory did. "I wanted my own life in my own way," she said. Soon she joined the Red Cross and sailed for Europe. She wrote about refugees living in caves. They'd lost their homes because of the war. Marjory gave them what comfort she could, warm pajamas and powdered milk. When the war ended, she returned to Florida, but hardly recognized it. Workers dynamited, dug, and drained waterways to build. Trains, boats, automobiles arrived jammed with people, she said. Developers saw the soggy muck of the Everglades as useless swampland. "Drain the Everglades," they insisted. Speculators snapped up land by the gallon. Marjory didn't want the old Florida she knew to disappear, so she decided to write about it. She studied its rare birds. She searched for secluded beaches, swimming under the moonlight. She putt-putted along Florida's new highway with her friends, right to the edge of the Everglades. They fished for breakfast and cooked it on a fire. Munching on garfish, Marjory watched the sun rise, giant and orange, then flamingo pink. The grass and the islands of the hardwood stood alone in the light and the beautiful air, she said. But at 40 years old, Marjory had never been inside the Everglades until she met gardener Ernest Coe. Coe believed that the Everglades had to be preserved before they disappeared forever. He read how much Marjory knew about the birds and the fish. Would she go on a trip to help him convince park officials to make the Everglades a national park? Marjory couldn't wait to go, but having never lived outdoors, she packed for a party instead of a camping trip. Traveling by houseboat, Marjory meandered through the glades in a string of pearls and a silk dress with pleats as thick as the sawgrass jutting through the shallow waters. She spotted crocodiles swimming, alligators soaking up the sun, and the wiry roots of ghost orchids wrapped around the trunks of pond apples. She saw sea turtles round as rain barrels, bobbing through forests of gumbo limbo. Soon, Marjory was covered in mosquito bites. She didn't care. She'd fallen in love with the Everglades. The people from the National Park Service felt differently. A swamp is a swamp, they complained, swatting at mosquitoes. Where were the mountains, the canyons, and the rushing waterfalls? Who would ever visit the bug-infested Everglades? At night, as manatees slept near the houseboat, hunters sailed silently by, hoisting fiery torches. They headed for the rookeries to snatch egrets and sell their feathers for women's hats. Marjory knew that the Everglades had to become a national park to save the birds, the plants, and the other wildlife. But without majestic mountains and bug-free canyons, how would she persuade park officials to love Florida's birds the way she did and to protect them? What if they could somehow fly with the birds? That was the answer, riding in the sky in a giant balloon. Up the dirigible rose, with Marjory and the group in it, floating above the Everglades. Below them, the shallow waters gleamed amber, curling through green and yellow prairies and sandhills of Sisyphus, coiling around tree islands of red and black mangroves, arching across South Florida like the tentacles of a giant squid. It was all so beautiful and unique, for once Marjory had no words to describe it. Marjory and the others floated, free as birds, while the throaty sounds of fire plumes puff-puffed to keep them aloft. In the late afternoon, the sounds of birds flying home drowned out the thrumming of the engine's flames. Sky became feathers. Wood storks circled. Egrets and ibis swooped and dived. Marjory recognized all of them. 10, 20, 30,000 birds cast shadows against the pink sky. The park officials had never seen so many birds in one place. By the time the sun had set, they'd forgotten about canyons and mountains. Marjory, Ernest Coe, and the birds had convinced them to make the Everglades a national park. The ride in the sky stayed with Marjory long after her mosquito bites had healed. She built a curious cottage perfect for one person, plus several cats. She painted the walls flamingo pink. Under its roof, which coiled and curled like the Everglades waters, Marjory studied her house cats and thought of the Florida panther. Were the Everglades really a swamp? Marjory didn't think so. How could a place where flamingos flocked and thatch palms thrived be swampland where water stood still? Marjory had to find out. But in the 1940s, there wasn't much scientific research on how the Everglades worked. Marjory asked geologists and anthropologists mountains of questions. She examined the Everglades muck wearing a hat made of straw, never feathers. She learned about limestone sandcastles tunneling below the mud. 57-year-old Marjory dug deep into her research and made a monumental discovery. The Everglades weren't a swamp at all, but a river. A slow-moving, life-giving river of grass. With those 3 words, I changed everybody's knowledge, she said. Freshwater into saltwater, pine lands into lowlands, from the Kissimmee River into Lake Okeechobee, the Everglades teemed with life. It supported so many kinds of life that it formed its own ecosystem, an ecosystem kept alive by water that Floridians depended on. There are no other Everglades in the world, she said. Though Marjory wasn't a scientist, she made bold scientific discoveries. Using her voice for good, she wrote about them in a book called The Everglades, River of Grass. With language so lovely and logical, Marjory changed people's minds about the Everglades. For the first time, they knew why the Everglades mattered. Wherever fresh water runs and the sawgrass starts up, that's where you have the Everglades, she said. But the mighty builders from the U.S. Army had different plans for the Everglades. They straightened the natural curves of the Kissimmee River to control its water. The ancient river became a canal. They called it C-38. Lake Okeechobee became polluted. Birds died. The Everglades began to dry up. Marjory was heartbroken. The Everglades were dying, she said. And now there were plans to build a gigantic airport, a jetport, right in the middle of the Everglades, cementing curves where water flowed and crocodiles and alligators swam. Marjory's friend Joe Browder was trying to stop the jetport. He knocked on the door of her curious cottage and asked for help. "But I'm just one person," she replied. "No one would pay any attention to me." Joe drove Marjory to the jetport site. One runway had already been built. By now, Marjory's eyesight had grown weak. The stronger, bigger glasses she wore didn't help much. As she walked toward the runway, shafts of brilliant tropical light caught the corners of Marjory's eyes where she could still see. She walked into this glow until a giant fence with a great big sign stopped her. "The world's first all-new jetport for the supersonic age," it read. Marjory knew that supersonic meant the end of the Everglades. She had to find a way to stop it. "People only listen to organizations," she whispered to Joe. "Why don't you start an organization?" he asked. Marjory was almost 80 years old. She was nearly deaf and blind, but making a difference had nothing to do with those things. At that moment, as ibis flew above her, their wings flapping like the sound of 1,000 silken ribbons, and raindrops tat-a-tat-tapped on her straw hat, Marjory became an activist. "Every time it rains, we know the Everglades are there," she said. Marjory started Friends of the Everglades. Marjory and her Everglades friends rode around Lake Okeechobee in an old camper. Motoring from town to town, Marjory told the residents why the jetport must be stopped and how important the Everglades were to Florida. "No matter how poor my eyes are, I can still talk," Marjory said. 300 people became Friends of the Everglades, then 6,000, children and grown-ups. Anyone could join for $1. "Be a nuisance," Marjory urged her Everglades friends. "Never give up." The jetport builders didn't take Marjory seriously. They joked that they'd give earmuffs to the alligators so the jumbo jets wouldn't disturb them. "We're going to build the jetport," they warned Marjory, "whether you like it or not." But the governor of Florida and the president of the United States took Marjory very seriously. They pored over a study that found what Marjory already knew. The jetport would destroy the Everglades. Marjory and the study convinced the president that the jetport was a bad idea, and the jetport was stopped. As the years passed, people forgot about the jetport. Sugarcane farmers reclaimed the Everglades water for their crops. Land developers drained more Everglades muck to build new towns. Most of all, they wanted Marjory to stop talking about saving the Everglades and its water. People must come to realize that it's all the same water, from the Kissimmee to Okeechobee to the Everglades, she said. 93-year-old Marjory refused to be silent. As mosquitoes buzzed and bit at town meetings, she spoke her mind. "Go home, Granny," people yelled and hissed. "Butterfly chaser," they booed. "Can't you boo any louder than that?" Marjory demanded. "I've got all night, and I'm used to the heat." Whenever Marjory spoke, she spoke the truth, no matter how unpopular her words were. "If the Everglades go, then South Florida becomes a desert," Marjory explained. What Marjory wanted for the Everglades was radical, enormous, and monumental. It was something that only Marjory dared to dream. What the Everglades needed, Marjory knew, was to be made whole again. The Everglades is a test. If we pass it, we get to keep the planet, she said. After nearly 100 years of dredging, draining, and polluting, Marjory convinced the government to restore the Everglades. They worked to put the Everglades back the way they found it. It became the largest restoration project in American history. Engineers tore up the canals they had built. They filled in the ditches and gave the Everglades back its curves. Soon, water meandered through South Florida. Sawgrass became submerged. The birds came back, ibis and egrets and wood storks. So did the sea turtles, the crocs and the alligators, returning the Everglades to what it was always meant to be, a river of grass. One person had made a difference, slow and steady at first, then whoosh, like a tidal wave. Marjory Stoneman Douglas saved the Everglades. So I want to thank you for reading aloud with me today and learning about Marjory in Marjory Saves the Everglades, the story of Marjory Stoneman Douglas. And don't forget, you can head on over to my website at sandraneilwallace.com and download the activity kit. And you can watch more read-alouds on the Simon Kids channel.